Winter cabins are meant to be safe, a place to wait out the storm, lock the door, and survive the night. But every winter, people disappear inside isolated cabins, places where the snow blocks the road, the signal dies, and help never comes. Tonight, you will hear 10 true horror stories from isolated winter cabins, where silence feels alive, darkness presses in, and being alone becomes terrifying. Story 1. Cabin that wasn't on the map. I saw the cabin through the trees on my 4th day alone in the mountains, and I knew immediately that something about it was wrong. Not wrong in any way I could explain to someone else. Not obviously dangerous or out of place. Just wrong in the way your body knows things before your mind catches up. The kind of wrong that makes your hands go cold even though you were wearing gloves. I had been hiking the Northern Ridge Trail in the Adirondacks for almost a week. February isolation, the kind where you can walk for days without seeing another person. That was the point. After the divorce, after losing the job, after watching my entire life collapse in the span of 6 months, I needed the silence. I needed to be somewhere so empty that I could hear myself think again. The cabin sat in a small clearing about 200 yards off the trail. Wood construction, dark weathered boards, a single window facing my direction. Smoke rose from a metal chimney pipe in thin gray lines that disappeared into the overcast sky. I stood there in the snow, staring at it, trying to figure out what bothered me. I had studied the maps carefully before this trip. Topographic maps, Forest Service maps, trail guides. I had marked every shelter, every ranger station, every maintained structure within 15 miles of my road. This cabin was not on any of them. That alone wasn't necessarily unusual. Private property existed throughout these mountains. Old hunting camps, family retreats, forgotten homesteads. But something about seeing it there, in that particular spot, made my stomach tighten. The smoke meant someone was inside, or had been recently. I checked my GPS. The nearest marked trail was 3 miles south. The nearest road was 7 miles east. I was deep in backcountry territory, in a section of forest where the trees grew so thick that even in winter, with bare branches, the shadows felt permanent. I should have kept walking. Instead, I stood there in the snow, watching that thin line of smoke rise into the gray afternoon sky, and felt the first whisper of fear move through me like cold air finding a gap in my jacket. The cabin, a single window, was dark. Not curtained, not covered, just dark, as if the interior existed in a different kind of shadow than the forest around it. I told myself I was being paranoid. Isolation does that to your mind. 4 days alone in winter woods, and you start seeing patterns that aren't there. You start feeling watched when nothing is watching. Your thoughts turn inward and feed on themselves until fear becomes indistinguishable from imagination. But I had felt fine until now. Calm, even. The solitude had been exactly what I needed. This was different. I pulled out my phone, knowing already that there would be no signal. There hadn't been signal since the 2nd day. But I checked anyway, some desperate hope that maybe here, in this clearing, something would connect me to the world beyond these trees. Nothing. The temperature was dropping. I could feel it in the way the air moved, in the stillness between the branches. Another storm was coming. The weather report I had checked before losing signal had mentioned possible snow, but out here, possible always meant inevitable. I looked at the cabin again. The smoke continued its steady rise. Someone had built a fire. Someone was staying warm. The smart thing would be to keep moving. Stick to the trail. Make it to the shelter I had marked on my map, another 4 miles south. Arrive before dark. Stay safe in a known location. But 4 more miles and dropping temperatures with a storm approaching was not appealing. And if someone was in that cabin, maybe they had a radio. Maybe they could tell me about trail conditions ahead. Maybe they were just another hiker, someone who knew these woods better than I did. Maybe I stepped off the trail and started walking toward the cabin. The snow was deeper here, untouched by other footprints. My boots broke through the frozen surface layer with each step, sinking 6 inches, then 8. The trees seemed to lean closer as I approached the clearing, their branches forming a canopy that blocked what little light remained in the afternoon sky. 50 yards from the cabin, I stopped. There was still no movement from the window. No sound except the soft crunch of my own breathing and the distant whisper of wind through bare branches. The cabin looked older up close. Not abandoned, but worn. The wood was dark with age and weather. The boards fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. No nails visible, no modern materials, just wood and time. The door was closed. No porch, no steps, just a door set directly into the front wall, about a foot above the snow line. I called out. My voice sounded strange in the silence, too loud and too small at the same time. No response. I called again, louder this time, announcing myself, telling whoever might be inside that I was just a hiker, just passing through, just wondering if they had any information about the trails ahead. Still nothing. The smoke continued rising from the chimney. Steady, consistent, the kind of smoke that comes from a fire that has been tended recently. I walked closer, 20 yards now, close enough to see the grain in the wood, the way frost had formed in delicate patterns along the windowsill. The window remained dark, not covered, not curtained, just dark, as if the interior of the cabin existed in a space where light couldn't reach. 10 yards, I could see my breath in the cold air, white clouds that dissipated quickly. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since I left the trail. My fingers were starting to go numb despite the gloves. 5 yards, I stopped directly in front of the door. Up close, I could see that it was slightly ajar. Not open, but not fully closed. A gap of maybe an inch, just wide enough to let cold air seep through. Just wide enough to suggest that whoever had been inside had left in a hurry. Or was still inside, watching through that dark window, waiting to see what I would do. I reached out and knocked. 3 solid taps that echoed strangely, as if the cabin were larger inside than it appeared from outside. Nothing. I waited, counting seconds in my head. 30, 60, 2 minutes. The wind picked up, moving through the trees with a sound like distant voices. The first few snowflakes began to fall, small and dry, the kind that comes before a real storm. I pushed the door open. The hinges made no sound. The door swung inward smoothly, as if it had been oiled recently, revealing the interior of the cabin in gradual degrees. Darkness first, then shapes emerging from that darkness. A wood stove in the corner, its door closed but warmth radiating from the metal. A small table, 2 chairs, a cot against the far wall with a wool blanket folded neatly at one end. No person, no signs of recent occupation except for the fire in the stove, which burned with steady orange light visible through the grate. I stepped inside. The air was warm, not hot, but comfortable, the kind of warmth that takes hours to build in a space this size. Whoever had been here for a while. The cabin was small, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet. 1 room, no closets, no bathroom, no kitchen beyond the wood stove. The walls were bare wood, the same dark weathered boards as the exterior. The floor was wood as well, worn smooth by decades of use. Everything was neat, organized. The table had nothing on it. The chairs were pushed in. The cot looked like it hadn't been slept in, but the stove was warm. The fire inside was burning. I walked to the stove and opened the door. Fresh wood, recently added. The coals beneath glowed bright orange. Someone had been here within the last hour. I turned and looked at the window from inside. It wasn't dark because of curtains or boards. It was dark because something outside blocked the light. Trees, maybe, or the angle of the afternoon sun. But from inside, looking out, I could see the clearing, the trees beyond, the gray sky. From outside, looking in, there had been only darkness. I didn't like that. I didn't like the way my perspective had been wrong. The door was still open behind me, letting in cold air that mixed with the warmth from the stove. I should have closed it, should have shut out the cold, but something made me want to keep it open, to maintain a clear path to the outside. The cabin had no other doors, no back exit. The window didn't open. I could see the frame was sealed, painted shut or frozen or simply built that way. One way in, one way out. I walked to the cot and touched the blanket. Wool, old but clean. I lifted it and found nothing beneath. No supplies, no personal items, nothing to indicate who had been staying here or why. The table had 2 chairs, both empty, both positioned as if waiting for someone to sit down. I checked under the table. Nothing. I checked the corners of the room. Nothing. The cabin was completely empty except for the furniture and the fire. And yet someone had been here recently. Someone had built that fire. I stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, trying to see what I was missing, trying to find some clue, some explanation. The walls were bare, no pictures, no hooks for hanging clothes, no shelves for storage. The floor had no seams, no trapdoor, no hidden access to a cellar. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet high, with exposed beams that ran from wall to wall. Everything was wood. Dark, old, empty. I walked back to the door and looked outside. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes larger, the wind pushing them sideways through the trees. My footprints were already starting to fill in. The trail was 200 yards behind me. In this snow, in this failing light, it would be harder to find. I should leave now, get back to the trail before the storm got worse, make it to the marked shelter before dark. But the storm was here. The temperature was dropping. Walking 4 miles in these conditions, with visibility decreasing and cold intensifying, was dangerous. The cabin was warm. The cabin had shelter. The cabin had a fire that could keep me alive through the night. I stepped back inside and closed the door. The warmth enveloped me immediately. My fingers started to tingle as feeling returned. I pulled off my gloves and held my hands near the stove, letting the heat penetrate. Outside, the wind picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees, a low moan that rose and fell in waves. I would stay until the storm passed. Just a few hours, long enough to warm up, long enough to let the worst of it blow through. Then I would leave, get back to the trail, continue south. I sat down in one of the chairs and pulled out my water bottle. The water was cold but not frozen. I drank half and put it back in my pack. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire and the wind outside. I stared at the window. From inside, I could see out clearly. The clearing, the trees, the snow falling in thick curtains. But I remembered how it had looked from outside. Dark, impenetrable, as if the interior existed in a different kind of space. I stood and walked to the window, put my face close to the glass, looked out at the clearing where I had been standing less than 10 minutes ago. My footprints were gone, completely covered by new snow. The storm had intensified faster than I expected. I pressed my hand against the glass. Cold, solid, real. I turned and looked back at the room. The stove, the table, the chairs, the cot, everything exactly as it had been. I sat back down and waited for the feeling of wrongness to pass. It didn't pass. Instead, it grew, slowly, quietly, like cold water rising. The cabin was too neat, too empty, too perfect in its simplicity. And the fire in the stove kept burning, steady and warm, even though I hadn't added any wood. I stood and opened the stove door again. The fire was still going, the flames just as strong as when I first arrived. But the wood should have burned down by now, should have needed more fuel. I looked closer. The logs inside were barely consumed, barely charred, as if they had just been placed there, even though I knew at least 15 minutes had passed since I came inside. I closed the stove door and stepped back. The wind outside grew louder. Not just wind now, something else in the sound. Something that might have been voices if you listened the wrong way. I walked to the door and tried to open it. It didn't move. I pulled harder. Still nothing. The door was stuck. Frozen, maybe, or swollen from moisture in the wood. I pulled again, using both hands, putting my weight into it. The door wouldn't budge. My heart started beating faster. The warmth in the cabin suddenly felt too warm, too close. I went to the window and tried to open it, knowing already that it wouldn't work. The frame was sealed, painted shut, maybe nailed. I pushed anyway, pulled, tried to break the seal. Nothing. I turned back to the room. The stove, the table, the chairs, the cot. One way in, no way out. The fire in the stove continued to burn. The logs inside remained unconsumed. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the warmth pressed against my skin like a living thing. I sat down in the chair and tried to think, tried to understand what was happening. The cabin wasn't on the map. The smoke had risen from the chimney even though no one was inside. The window was dark from outside but clear from inside. The fire burned without consuming wood. The door wouldn't open. None of it made sense. Unless the cabin wasn't real. Unless I was experiencing hypothermia. Unless my mind had started to fail in the cold and I was hallucinating this shelter, this warmth, this safety. But I felt warm. I felt awake. My thoughts were clear. Too clear. Maybe. I stood and walked to the cot, sat down on the edge. The blanket was there, folded neatly, waiting. Outside, the wind screamed through the trees. Inside, the silence between wind gusts felt heavier than before, thicker. I lay down on the cot and pulled the blanket over me. The wool was soft against my face. It smelled like smoke and time. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, just to rest. When I opened them again, the light had changed. Not darker, not lighter, just different. The window showed the same scene. Trees, snow, storm, but the angle was wrong. The perspective had shifted, as if the cabin had turned slightly while my eyes were closed. I sat up quickly, looked around. Everything was the same. The stove, the table, the chairs, but they felt different now. More present, more real. Or maybe I felt less real. I stood and walked to the door again. Pulled. Nothing. I went to the window, pressed my hands against the glass. Outside, through the falling snow, I saw something move between the trees. A shape, dark, tall. It moved from one tree to another, smooth and deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was going. I pressed closer to the glass, trying to see better. The shape stopped, turned, looked directly at the cabin. At me. It had no face, no features, just darkness in the shape of something that might have been human once. It stood there in the snow, perfectly still, while the storm raged around it. Then it started walking toward the cabin. I stepped back from the window. My hands were shaking. My breath came faster. The shape moved through the snow without leaving footprints, without displacing the falling flakes. It simply moved forward, steady and inevitable, until it reached the edge of the clearing. Then it stopped. I waited, watching, unable to move. The shape stood at the edge of the clearing for what felt like hours but was probably seconds. Then it turned and walked back into the trees, disappeared between the trunks, gone. I stood there, staring at the empty clearing, trying to understand what I had just seen. The fire in the stove popped softly. The wind outside began to fade. I looked at the door. Still closed. Still stuck. I looked at the window. Still sealed. I looked at the cot, at the blanket, at the warmth that pressed against me like a promise. The cabin wasn't on the map because the cabin wasn't part of the world I knew. I understood that now. The smoke I had seen rising through the trees was meant to draw me here. The warmth was meant to keep me here. The storm was meant to make me stay. And now that I was inside, now that I had chosen to enter, the cabin would not let me leave. Not until it was finished with whatever it needed from me. I sat down in the chair again, folded my hands in my lap, stared at the fire that wouldn't stop burning. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, the warmth never changed. And somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing, the shape waited. The hours passed slowly after that, though I had no real way to measure time. My watch had stopped working. The hands frozen at 3:47, though I couldn't remember what time I had entered the cabin. The light outside never fully faded into night, never brightened into day. It remained the same dim gray, the same perpetual twilight, as if the cabin existed in a pocket of time where nothing moved forward or back. I tried the door again, and again, and again. It never opened. The fire kept burning. The warmth never changed. My water bottle remained half full no matter how many times I drank from it. Nothing consumed. Nothing changed. Nothing ended. I sleep now, sometimes. Or I think I sleep. It is hard to tell the difference between sleeping and waking in a place where time doesn't move. The shape in the trees comes closer each time I look, standing at the edge of the clearing, then halfway across, then just beyond the window. Soon it will be inside. Or maybe it has been inside all along. And I, the one standing in the trees, watching the cabin from a distance, seeing smoke rise from a chimney that has no fire, staring at a window that shows only darkness, wondering why I can't remember how I got here or when I'll be allowed to leave. Story 2. Cabin had no mirrors. I should have noticed it immediately when I arrived. The cabin sat 40 miles from the nearest town, buried in the kind of forest where cell towers never reach and winter comes early. I rented it for 2 weeks through a website that showed clean photos and promised isolation. That part was true. The road in was barely visible under fresh snow, and by the time I parked, the sky had already turned that heavy gray that means more is coming. I needed the silence. 3 months of sleepless nights and the constant hum of city noise had pushed me to the edge of something I did not want to name. My doctor suggested rest. My ex-wife suggested therapy. I chose distance instead. The cabin was smaller than the photos implied. One main room with a wood stove, a kitchenette, a bedroom barely large enough for the bed, and a bathroom with a shower that dripped even when turned off. The walls were dark pine, stained almost black with age. No television, no internet. The listing promised these absences as features. I had brought books, supplies, and enough canned food to last 3 weeks if necessary. What I did not bring was a backup plan. The snow started falling harder around dusk. I built a fire and watched through the window as the trees slowly disappeared behind thick curtains of white. The silence was absolute. No wind, no distant traffic, no voices, just the occasional crack of wood in the stove and the soft whisper of snow piling against the glass. That first night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. I woke to darkness so complete I could not see my own hand in front of my face. The fire had died. The room felt colder than it should. I reached for my phone on the bedside table and pressed the button. No signal, as expected. But the battery was full. The screen light was harsh and blue, and it showed 3:47 a.m. I used the light to navigate to the main room and rebuild the fire. As I knelt by the stove, arranging kindling, I noticed something I had missed before. There were no mirrors anywhere in the cabin. Not in the bathroom above the sink. Not on the bedroom wall. Not even a decorative one near the door. I found this strange but not alarming. Some people prefer spaces without their own reflection. The storm continued through the next day and the day after that. The snow climbed past the windows. I kept the fire burning and rationed my supplies carefully. I read. I wrote in a journal I had brought but never used before. I tried to relax into the isolation, into the long hours of silence. But something felt wrong. It was subtle at first. Small things. The wood stove burned through logs faster than it should. I refilled it constantly, yet the cabin never felt warm. My breath still clouded in the air even with the fire roaring. I wrapped myself in blankets and stayed close to the heat, but the cold seemed to come from inside the walls. On the fourth day, the power went out. It happened in the middle of the afternoon. The single overhead light I had been using flickered twice and died. I checked the breaker box near the back door. Everything looked normal, but flipping the switches did nothing. Outside, the snow had buried the propane tank and climbed halfway up the exterior walls. I could not see the road anymore. I could not see the car. I told myself it was fine. I had the wood stove. I had flashlights and candles. I had food. I would wait out the storm and hike to the main road when it cleared. Someone would pass eventually. That night, I heard footsteps on the roof. They were slow and deliberate, not the random sounds of snow sliding or branches falling. These were rhythmic, purposeful. They moved from one end of the cabin to the other, then stopped directly above my bed. I lay frozen under the blankets, listening. The footsteps started again, crossing back the other way. They stopped. Then they started again. I told myself it was an animal, a deer or a fox walking across the accumulated snow. But the steps were too heavy, too evenly spaced. They continued for an hour before finally stopping. I did not sleep. When morning came, I forced myself outside to check the roof. The snow had drifted so high against the cabin that I could climb onto the roof easily. I expected to see tracks, proof of something real. The snow on the roof was smooth and untouched. I stood there in the freezing air, staring at the unmarked white surface, and felt the first real thread of fear pull tight in my chest. Back inside, I tried to stay rational. I made coffee on the camp stove I had brought. I ate a can of soup. I read the same page of my book 5 times without absorbing a single word. The isolation was supposed to be healing. It was supposed to quiet my mind. Instead, the silence had begun to feel like pressure, like something waiting. That afternoon, I noticed the windows. The snow outside had climbed so high that only the top few inches of glass were still visible. The light that came through was dim and gray, filtered through layers of white. But when I looked closely at the glass, I saw condensation on the inside. My breath, I thought, the warmth from the fire meeting the cold. But the condensation was not random. It formed patterns, streaks that looked almost like letters, like someone had dragged their fingers across the glass from the other side. I wiped it away and stepped back. Within an hour, it had returned. The same streaks, the same patterns. I stopped looking at the windows. On the 6th day, I realized I had not seen my reflection since I arrived. The thought came suddenly while I was washing my hands in the bathroom. I looked up at the empty space above the sink where a mirror should be and felt a strange vertigo. I could not remember the last time I had seen my own face. 6 days without a mirror. No phone camera. No reflective surfaces. I held my phone up and opened the camera app, pointing it at myself. The screen showed the bathroom wall behind me. I moved the phone closer to my face. The image on the screen stayed fixed on the wall. I turned the camera around, checking to see if I had somehow switched it. The rear camera worked fine. It showed the sink, the faucet, my hands holding the phone. I switched back to the front camera and pointed it at my face again. The wall. I dropped the phone. It clattered into the sink. When I picked it up, the screen was black. Dead. The battery, which had been at 60%, was gone. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was a malfunction, a glitch caused by the cold. But I could not shake the feeling that something had just gone very wrong. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were inside. I heard them moving through the main room while I lay in bed. Slow, heavy. The floor creaked under weight that should not have been there. I had locked the door. I had checked it twice. The footsteps moved toward the bedroom. I sat up, my heart slamming against my ribs. I had a flashlight on the bedside table. I grabbed it and pointed it at the doorway. The beam showed nothing, but the footsteps continued. They crossed the threshold. They moved to the foot of the bed. They stopped. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. Not my own. I swept the flashlight across the room. The beam passed through empty space. Nothing. No one. But the breathing continued. I did not move. I did not speak. I sat frozen with the flashlight shaking in my hand, listening to something breathe in the darkness inches from where I sat. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I spent the rest of the night in the main room, feeding the fire, keeping every light I had burning. When dawn finally came, gray and weak through the buried windows, I made a decision. I was leaving. Storm or no storm, I would dig out the car and drive until I found a signal or another person or anything that was not this cabin. I dressed in every layer I had and opened the front door. The snow had climbed above the doorframe. I was looking at a solid wall of white. I pushed against it. It was packed hard, compressed by wind and weight. I would need to dig. I found a metal spade in the closet and started carving a tunnel through the snow. It took hours. My arms burned. My lungs ached from the cold air. But I kept digging, inch by inch, until finally the spade broke through into open air. I climbed out into the blinding white landscape. The car was gone. Not buried. Gone. I stood in the clearing where I had parked, staring at untouched snow. No tire tracks, no impression, nothing to indicate a vehicle had ever been there. I turned back to the cabin. The tunnel I had just dug was gone. The door was closed. The snow was smooth and unmarked. I was standing in front of a cabin I could not have just exited. The fear that had been building inside me finally broke through. I ran. I did not know where. I just ran into the trees, crashing through drifts, falling, getting up, running more. The forest was identical in every direction. The same trees, the same snow, no landmarks, no paths. I ran until my legs gave out. Then I collapsed into the snow and lay there, gasping, staring up at the flat gray sky. When I finally stood, I saw the cabin 20 feet away. I had run in a straight line for what felt like miles. But here it was, waiting. I walked back inside because there was nowhere else to go. That night, I stopped trying to make sense of it. I sit by the fire now, writing this in my journal because I need to record it. I need someone to know. The footsteps have started again. They are inside the walls now, moving through the spaces where nothing should be. I hear them circling, getting closer. I have not seen my face in 8 days. I have not seen another person. I have not seen anything in the windows except gray light and my own breath condensing into patterns I do not understand. The cabin feels smaller. The walls are closer than they were yesterday. The ceiling is lower. I think I've been here much longer than 8 days. I think the storm never started. I think I brought the isolation with me and now it has nowhere else to go except deeper. The fire is dying. I should add more wood. But I can hear something breathing behind me. And I am afraid if I turn around, I will finally see what has been watching me since I arrived. I am afraid I will see nothing at all. Cabins offer shelter, but they also cut people off from the world. Story 3. Door was open in the morning. I knew something was wrong before I opened my eyes. That is the part that stays with me now, in the quiet hours when I cannot sleep. Not the thing itself, but the knowing. The body recognizes threat before the mind catches up. The cabin was too silent. I had rented it for the week, a small structure set back from the highway, surrounded by nothing but white pine and snow that had fallen thick and steady for 2 days. I came here to be alone. That was the entire purpose. Silence, isolation, the kind of solitude that feels like medicine when your life has become too loud, too crowded, too full of people who want things from you that you cannot give. But silence, I have learned, is not the same as peace. When you lie in a small bed in the dark and the world outside is completely still, you notice when something moves. You notice the smallest shift in pressure. I noticed it before dawn, that sense of wrongness that pulled me from whatever shallow sleep I had managed. My eyes opened to the darkness of the bedroom, and I stayed still for a long time, listening. The wind had stopped. That was the first thing. The wind that had been constant for 2 days, battering the cabin with snow and sound, had simply ceased. The silence that replaced it was so complete it felt like a presence in itself. Like the world had been holding its breath and forgotten to exhale. I lay there for what might have been minutes or might have been an hour. Time moves strangely in the dark. I could feel my heartbeat, steady but present. A reminder that I was still alive in a place where nothing else seemed to be. The cold had crept deeper into the room. I could see my breath as a pale whisper in the darkness. Then I realized why the cold was worse. The door to the bedroom was open. I was certain I had closed it. I always close doors. Even in hotels, even in places where I am only passing through, I close doors behind me. It is a habit so ingrained I do not have to think about it. Close the door, lock it, be sealed away. But the door was open now. Not wide, just enough that I could see the outline of the small hallway beyond, slightly less dark than the room I was in. Just enough that I could feel the cold air moving through that gap, bringing with it the temperature from the main room, the kitchen, the front of the cabin where the temperature would be even lower. I did not move. My mind offered me reasonable explanations. The door had not been closed all the way. I had simply thought I closed it. The house had settled, moved with the cold, and the door had drifted open on its hinges. These things happen in old structures in winter. Wood shrinks, hinges shift, doors open, but I knew I had closed it. I got out of bed slowly, pulling the heavy blanket with me because the cold was the kind that follows you, that seeps into your clothes and skin and settles somewhere deep in your core. The wooden floor was freezing under my feet. The darkness in the hallway was absolute. I reached out and pushed the door open wider, and that is when I understood that something was very wrong. The front door of the cabin was open. Not ajar, not drifting, open, standing open to the winter night, to the darkness beyond, to whatever was out there in the snow and the shadows between the trees. Cold air poured in steadily, bringing with it the smell of snow and distance and something else, something that might have been frost or might have been something else entirely, a quality to the air that made my throat tight. I stood in the darkness of my cabin and stared at that open door, and I did not understand how it had opened. I had locked it, I was certain of that. I had arrived in the late afternoon, before the heavy snow, had checked that door and the back door and all the windows. I had turned the deadbolt. I had felt it catch. That small, solid sound of security. That was the first thing I always did in any space that was supposed to be mine, even temporarily. My hands were shaking when I walked to the front door. Not from fear, not yet. From cold. From the unreality of the moment. From the sense that I had stepped outside of normal time and into something else. The snow outside was undisturbed. That is what stopped my breath. The snow on the porch, the snow on the ground leading away from the cabin, was completely smooth. Unmarked, no footprints coming or going. No indication that anything or anyone had walked through it and crossed the threshold of this locked cabin. I stood in the doorway looking out at that perfect, unbroken snow, and something in my chest tightened to the point of pain. I closed the door and locked it. Then I turned on every light in the cabin. All of them. The overhead fixtures, the lamps, the kitchen lights, everything. The sudden brightness was almost violent after the hours of darkness. The cabin looked completely normal. Small, empty, everything exactly as I had left it when I went to bed. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. The door had been locked. I was certain of it. And the snow was undisturbed. These two facts existed in my mind at the same time, and they could not both be true. I sat on the edge of the couch with every light on, and I tried to think of explanations. Perhaps I had sleepwalked. Perhaps I had gotten up in the night, unlocked the door in some fog of sleep, and opened it, and then returned to bed without remembering. It was possible. The body does strange things. The mind does stranger things still. But I would have felt the cold. I would have felt the snow. I would have left footprints. Unless I had not actually gone outside. Unless I had only opened the door. But then how could I have forgotten something like that? The night had somehow moved into early morning while I was sitting there. The windows began to lighten at the edges, that gradual shift from absolute darkness to the gray of pre-dawn, and I became aware of how tired I was. The exhaustion had settled into my bones, a heaviness that made every movement feel labored. I forced myself to get up and walk through the cabin again, checking everything. Every window locked, the back door locked, the front door locked, everything secure, everything as it should be. There was no sign of intrusion, no indication that anyone had been inside. But someone had opened that door. The certainty of it sat in my mind like a stone. I made coffee in the kitchen, moving mechanically, and I tried to convince myself that I was being irrational. That the mind plays tricks in isolation, in darkness, in small spaces where you are alone with your own thoughts for too long. That I had imagined the feeling of knowing the door was open, had imagined seeing it that way, had invented the whole sequence of events in some half-asleep state that was not quite dream and not quite waking. but the door had been locked, and it had been open, and there were no footprints in the snow. I did not leave the cabin that day. I stayed inside with all the lights on, even as the winter daylight filled the windows. I told myself I would leave the next morning, that I would pack my things and drive back to the city and pretend this week had never happened. That I would go back to my job and my apartment and my life that was loud and crowded and full of other people, and I would not come back to a place where doors open of their own accord in the night. But when I lay down to sleep that second night, I found that the bedroom door was open again. The fear was different this time. It was not the shock of the discovery, but the weight of realization. The understanding that whatever had happened the first night had not been a dream or a mistake or a trick of the mind. It had been real, and it was still happening. I did not sleep. I sat up in bed with the lights on and I listened to the cabin settle around me, and I tried to think of what could explain it. Wind, I thought, a draft so strong that it had pulled the doors open against the locks. But the locks had held. The deadbolt had not been broken. There was no indication of force. By the third morning, I had stopped trying to understand it. The doors opened, both nights, the front door wide to the winter darkness, the bedroom door open to the hallway. The snow undisturbed, everything else unchanged. I moved through the cabin like a ghost moving through my own life, checking locks that did not hold, staring out at snow that told me nothing, trying to exist in the space between what was happening and what was possible. I did not leave on the fourth day, though I had planned to. The road would be slick with ice by then. I told myself that was the reason, that it was safer to wait, that I should not drive in these conditions. The truth, though I could not quite admit it to myself, was that I was afraid of what I might find if I left. Or more precisely, I was afraid of what would happen to me in my car, alone on that long empty stretch of highway, in the darkness and isolation that was even more complete than the isolation of the cabin. At least the cabin was a known space. At least I could check the doors. At least I could turn on all the lights. The pattern continued. Every night the doors opened. Every morning the snow was unmarked. And every day I stayed inside, checking locks that had not been broken, staring out windows at a landscape that revealed nothing, waiting for something I could not name and did not understand. By the fifth day, I had stopped being afraid in the way I had been afraid at first. The fear had transformed into something else, a kind of resignation. An acceptance of the fact that something was happening that existed outside the logic I had built my life around. Something that had its own reasons and its own rules, and I was no longer operating within the world I thought I knew. On the sixth night, I did something I had not planned to do. I left the front door unlocked. I told myself it was to see what would happen, to understand better, to remove the mystery of whether the door was being opened or whether my perception was failing me. But the truth was simpler than that. I was tired of pretending the locks mattered, and I wanted to see if, when the door was already open, something else might happen instead. Nothing happened. The door remained open all night, as if it had always been open, as if it had been that way for days or weeks or years. I sat in the cabin with every light burning, and I watched that dark rectangle where the door hung open to the winter night, and I felt a kind of peace settle over me that I could not explain. When the morning came and the light began to return to the snow, I realized that I could not remember the last time I had thought about the world outside this cabin. I could not remember what I was running from. I could not remember why I had come here to be alone. All I knew was that I was here, and something knew I was here too. It was there in the way the cold moved through the open door, in the way the silence pressed against the windows, in the way the snow remained unmarked, as if nothing in this landscape was ever meant to move or change. On the morning of the seventh day, I did not check the locks at all. I sat on the couch with the lights still burning, though the sun was rising, and I listened to the wind begin to move again through the trees. It sounded like something breathing, like something that had been waiting, and now was stirring. I do not know what is happening to me. I do not know if I am still in the cabin or if I left days ago and have been driving on that highway in the darkness, unable to reach the city, unable to turn around. I do not know if the cold that has settled into my bones is winter or something else entirely. I only know that the doors are open now. All of them, and the snow is still unmarked, and I am still here, waiting for the moment when I understand that I was never meant to leave. The door was open in the morning, and now I think it always will be. Story 4. Tracks that circle back. The footprints were there when I woke up. I saw them through the kitchen window while making coffee, a perfect ring around the entire cabin, pressed deep into fresh snow that had fallen during the night. The storm had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving everything silent and white and still. The tracks were clear, recent, Someone had walked a complete circle around the building while I slept. But no prints led to the cabin, and none led away. I stood at the window, holding my coffee, watching steam rise from the cup while my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The isolation out here was supposed to be complete. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles down a Forest Service road that became impassable after the first heavy snow. I had come here specifically for that distance, that separation from everything. 2 weeks alone to finish the work I could not finish anywhere else. The footprints were large, boot treads, adult-sized. They formed a perfect circle, perhaps 10 feet from the walls, equidistant at every point, like someone had measured. I set down my coffee and pulled on my coat. The cold outside was sharp and immediate. My breath hung in clouds that did not dissipate. The sky was that pale winter blue that hurts to look at. The snow came up past my knees in the drifts. I waded through it to the nearest section of prints and crouched down. The treads were clear, deep, fresh enough that the edges had not started to soften. I followed them, walking alongside the circle, checking for any deviation. They maintained the same distance from the cabin all the way around. When I completed the circuit, I stood at my starting point and looked outward, scanning the tree line, the open meadow, the unbroken snow beyond. Nothing. No tracks approaching, no tracks leaving, just that single, perfect circle. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Someone had walked here before the snow started and the storm had covered their approach and exit while leaving this section protected by the cabin, the shadow or the wind pattern or something. I was not thinking clearly yet. The coffee had not taken hold. The fear had not fully registered. I went back inside and locked the door. The cabin was small. One main room with a kitchenette and wood stove. A bedroom barely large enough for the bed and a desk. A bathroom with a shower that rattled when the wind blew hard. I had rented it through a property management company that specialized in remote locations. The photos had shown exactly what I found. No internet, no cell service, a landline phone on the kitchen wall that connected to some central system I did not understand. I had called out on it once when I arrived to let my sister know I had made it safely. I tried the phone now. I picked up the receiver and listened to the dial tone, then pressed the numbers for my sister. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. No answer, no voicemail, just ringing that eventually stopped and returned to the dial tone. I tried again. Same result. I told myself she was busy. It was early. She was probably still asleep. I would try again later. I sat down at my desk and tried to work. The manuscript I had brought was spread across the surface, pages covered in red edits, sections marked for revision. I had been working on this book for 3 years. My editor had given me a final deadline. This trip was supposed to be the last push to finish it. But I could not focus. I kept looking out the window at those tracks. By midday, I had convinced myself to check them again. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was an explanation I had overlooked in my initial confusion. I put my coat back on and went outside. The tracks were still there, but now there was a second circle. This one was closer, perhaps 6 feet from the cabin walls. The same boot treads, the same depth, the same perfect spacing. It sat inside the first circle like a ring within a ring. My heart started beating faster. I turned slowly, scanning the forest, the meadow, every direction. Nothing moved, no sound except my own breathing. The snow beyond the tracks was completely undisturbed, smooth, unmarked. I walked the perimeter of the new circle, looking for any sign of how it had been made. The snow between the two rings showed no disturbance, no footprints crossing from one to the other. Whoever made the second circle had somehow done it without disturbing anything in between. The fear I had been pushing down all morning finally broke through. I went back inside and locked the door. Then I checked every window. Then I checked them again. The cabin had no curtains. The previous owner or the management company had apparently decided they were unnecessary this far from anyone. I could see out in every direction, which meant anything outside could see in. I pulled the desk away from the bedroom wall and pushed it against the main window, blocking the view. It felt childish, irrational, but I did it anyway. Then I tried the phone again. Still ringing. No answer. I spent the afternoon trying to work, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid, trying to ignore the creeping certainty that something was very wrong. The light outside began to fade early, the way it does in winter in the mountains. By 4, the shadows were long. By 5, it was dusk. I built a fire in the wood stove and kept the lights on in every room. When darkness finally came, complete and total, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at where I knew the tracks were. I could not see them anymore, just blackness pressed against the glass. Then I saw the light. It was faint, distant, moving through the trees at the edge of the meadow. A bobbing yellowish glow like a lantern or a flashlight. It moved slowly, parallel to the tree line, then stopped. The light stayed stationary for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it started moving again. Toward the cabin. I stepped back from the window. My hand found the phone and I picked it up without looking, pressing the numbers for emergency services. The phone rang once. Then the line went dead. Not a busy signal. Not a recorded message. Just silence. I tried again. Nothing. The dial tone was gone. I hung up and immediately picked the receiver back up. Silence. The light outside was closer now. I could see it more clearly. Definitely a flashlight. Handheld, moving at walking pace across the snow. I turned off all the lights inside the cabin. Darkness swallowed everything. I stood in the kitchen, breathing hard, listening to my own heartbeat, watching that light approach. It reached the outer circle of tracks and stopped. Then it started moving sideways, following the circle around the cabin. I moved to the bedroom window and watched it continue. It maintained the same distance, the same slow pace, tracing the path of the footprints I had seen that morning. When it reached the far side of the cabin, it disappeared from view. I ran back to the kitchen window and waited. It emerged on the other side, completing the circuit. When it returned to where it started, it stopped again. Then it moved closer. It followed the second circle now, the inner ring, moving around the cabin at that closer distance. I watched it pass each window, illuminating nothing but snow and darkness beyond its beam. When it completed that circuit, it stopped again. Then the light went out. I stood frozen in the dark cabin, staring at nothing, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. Just the terrible silence and the darkness pressing against every window. I did not turn the lights back on. I felt my way to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, still in my coat, watching the window. My eyes adjusted slowly. I could see the faint shapes of trees against the slightly lighter sky. I do not know when I fell asleep. Exhaustion or shock or some combination pulled me under despite the fear. When I woke, gray dawn light was seeping through the windows. And there was a third circle. I saw it from the bedroom window. This one was close enough to touch the cabin walls. The same boot treads, the same impossible spacing. 3 perfect rings now, tightening like a noose. I checked every door and window. All still locked, all secure, nothing disturbed inside. I tried the phone. Still dead. I tried to think rationally. Someone was doing this. A person. Not a ghost or a monster or anything supernatural. A person with boots and a flashlight who was deliberately trying to frighten me. Maybe the previous renter. Maybe someone who used this cabin and resented my presence. Maybe a local who did not like outsiders. But the rational explanations felt thin. Wrong. They did not account for the precision. The silence. The way the tracks appeared without any trace of approach. I spent the day watching the windows, jumping at every small sound, waiting for something to happen. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows shifted. Nothing changed. By evening I had made a decision. I was leaving. Storm or no storm, isolation or safety. I was getting in my truck and driving out. I would deal with the snowdrifts and the bad road and whatever else. Anything was better than another night here. I gathered my essential belongings and stuffed them in my bag. Then I put on every warm layer I had and opened the front door. The truck was gone. I stood in the doorway, staring at the empty space where I had parked 3 days ago. The snow there was smooth, undisturbed, like the truck had never existed. I walked out to where it should have been, my legs moving on autopilot while my mind struggled to process. I reached the spot and looked down. No tire tracks, no oil stains, no evidence at all. I turned back to the cabin. There was a 4th circle now. This one ran directly along the walls. And this time I could see something else. Places where the snow had been brushed aside at the base of the walls. Small cleared sections at regular intervals. I walked closer to examine one of them. The wood siding had been marked, scratched, deep gouges that looked like they had been made with a knife or a nail. The marks formed letters. You are not alone. I ran back inside and slammed the door. I shoved the kitchen table against it. Then I pushed the couch against the table. Then I grabbed the desk from the bedroom and added it to the barricade. My hands were shaking. My breath came in short gasps. The fear had become something physical, something that lived in my chest and throat. I tried to find a weapon. Anything. The cabin had been rented empty of anything useful. No knife block. No tools. I found a fire poker by the wood stove and held it in both hands. Then I waited. The sun went down. The darkness came back. I stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly, watching every window. The light appeared again at midnight. This time it did not stay outside. This time I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, measured. They crossed from one end to the other, then back. Then the door handle turned. The barricade held. The door pushed inward an inch before the furniture stopped it. The handle turned again, rattling. Then it stopped. The footsteps moved to the kitchen window. I saw the light through the glass. It played across the ceiling. Then it moved to the next window, and the next, circling the cabin. At each window I heard the same sound, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across the glass. When the light completed its circuit, it went out again. The footsteps stopped. I stood in the darkness, holding the fire poker, waiting for what came next. Nothing came. Hours passed. The silence was absolute. No wind, no movement, just me and the fear and the terrible certainty that something was waiting just outside. When dawn finally came, I approached the windows. There were words scratched into the frost on every pane. Come outside. I am writing this now because I do not know what else to do. The barricade is still in place. The phone is still dead. The truck is still gone. I have been here for 4 days now, or maybe 5. Time has started to feel wrong. Last night I thought I heard footsteps inside the cabin, in the walls, under the floor. This morning I found a 5th circle of tracks. This one is inside. It runs through the main room, perfect and impossible, pressed into the wood floor where there should be no snow at all. I checked the doors and windows again. All still locked, all still secure from the inside, but the tracks are here, in a circle around where I am sitting now. The distance is closing. The rings are tightening. I do not know if I have been alone this entire time or if I have never been alone at all. The sun is setting again. The light will return soon, and I think tonight it will finally come inside. The longer the storm lasts, the harder it becomes to tell what is normal. Story 5. Generator stopped at midnight. The silence woke me. Not a sound, but the absence of one. That low, constant hum that had been the soundtrack of my isolation for the past 5 days simply ceased, and my mind understood the threat before I was fully conscious. The generator had stopped. I lay in the darkness of the cabin and tried to remember when I had checked the fuel. Tuesday morning, I thought. Or was it Monday? The days had begun to blur together out here, separated only by the routine of checking doors, looking out windows, and listening to the generator work its steady rhythm in the shed behind the cabin. The power was gone. I moved out of bed slowly, my eyes already adjusting to the complete darkness. There was no moon that night. The clouds had come in during the evening, heavy and low, and the kind of darkness that comes with winter snow clouds is not like any other darkness. It is a darkness with weight, a darkness that seems to press inward. My watch said 12:17. Midnight had passed just minutes ago. I found the flashlight on the nightstand, though I had not remembered placing it there, and I pressed the switch. The beam cut through the dark cabin like a knife, illuminating dust in the air, the edge of the dresser, the small window above it that showed only black. I kept the light pointed downward and moved toward the kitchen, toward the shed door and back. The cabin was warm still, but I could feel the cold beginning to move in from the edges, seeping through gaps in the walls, waiting for the generator, his heat to disappear completely. Winter moves fast when you stop fighting it. I had learned that much already. The shed door was in the kitchen, a small metal door that led to the cramped space where the previous owner had installed the generator years ago. I opened it and stepped into a darkness so complete that even the flashlight seemed small and useless against it. The generator was silent. The tank was empty. I had filled it on Tuesday. I was certain. I could remember the smell of the fuel, the weight of the can, the way it splashed into the tank while my breath came out in white clouds that disappeared into the winter air. I had filled it completely. It should have lasted another 4 days at least. I stood there in the darkness of the shed, listening to the cold begin its slow work. And I did something I had not done since arriving at this cabin. I allowed myself to feel afraid. The cabin was 20 miles from the nearest town. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away across roads that were now impassable due to the snow. I had driven in through conditions that were already treacherous, and the weather had been worsening since then. My car was parked outside, but I had no cell service this far out. The landline phone worked, but the lines went down frequently in these storms. I had come here to be alone. That had been the entire point. A week without contact, without distraction, without the weight of other people, just needs and expectations. A week to exist in silence and solitude and think about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Now the silence and solitude felt like a trap. I went back into the cabin and closed the shed door behind me. The cold was already becoming noticeable. I could feel it in the way the air moved, in the way my breath began to form mist again even inside. I gathered blankets from the bedroom and wrapped them around myself on the couch, pointing the flashlight toward the window. The snow was falling again. I could see it in the beam of the light, the flakes moving downward in that way that makes distance impossible to judge. The snow could be feet away or hundreds of yards away. In the darkness, there was no way to know. I thought about the generator running for 5 days. I thought about that low hum that had become so constant I barely registered it anymore. And yet now that it was gone, its absence was deafening. That sound had meant safety. It had meant light and heat and electricity. It had meant I was not entirely cut off. Now it meant nothing. By 3 a.m, the cold had become an active presence in the cabin. Not the clean cold of winter air outside, but the creeping cold of a space that was slowly cooling, degree by degree. I could see my breath in the flashlight beam. I could feel it in my fingers and the tips of my ears. I needed to start a fire. The cabin had a fireplace, but I had not used it. The owner had left firewood stacked on the porch, and I had noticed it when I arrived, but something had made me hesitant to use it. Now I could not remember what that reason had been. Everything before the generator failed seemed to belong to a different time, a different version of myself. I gathered the blankets and moved toward the front door, keeping the flashlight low. The porch was dark, the kind of dark that opens up around you when the light is small and the space is larger than you expect. The firewood was stacked against the cabin wall, dark shapes that looked like something other than wood in the uncertain light. I was carrying an armload of logs back inside when I saw the footprint. It was in the snow on the porch, near the edge where the boards met the drifting white. A single print, pointed toward the cabin, the heel and toe clear despite the snow that had been falling for hours. Someone had walked across the porch recently. Someone had come from the road toward the cabin while I was inside with the generator failing and the cold moving in. I stood there holding the wood, and the fear that had been abstract until that moment became very real. I moved inside quickly and shut the door, locking it with hands that had begun to shake. The footprint had been fresh. The snow would have filled it completely if it had been more than an hour old. And I had been awake since the generator stopped. I had been moving around the cabin, in and out of the kitchen. I would have heard if someone had walked across the porch, unless they had walked across while I was in the shed, while I was focused on the dead generator in the darkness of that small space. I built a fire in the fireplace with shaking hands, stacking the wood badly, using nearly an entire armload of logs to get flames to start. The fire burned too hot, wasting wood, but I needed the light as much as I needed the heat. The flames danced across the walls, creating shadows that moved like living things. I sat in front of that fire and tried to think of explanations. A hiker, maybe. Someone who had gotten lost in the storm. Someone who had seen the cabin, approached it, and then decided to move on. Or perhaps someone who lived nearby, checking on properties in the area. But no one had knocked. No one had called out. Someone had simply approached the cabin in the darkness and snow and then left again without making contact. That was not the behavior of someone who needed help. By dawn, the fire had nearly burned through the wood I had brought in, and the cold had stopped advancing but not retreated. I added more wood carefully, trying to make it last, and I looked out the window at the road beyond the cabin. Snow was still falling. The wind had picked up. The world beyond the glass was white, featureless, and completely indifferent to the fact that I was here, isolated and afraid. I did not leave the cabin that day. I kept the fire going, fed it carefully, and I watched the windows for any sign of movement. By afternoon, I had convinced myself that the footprint meant nothing, that I had seen what I expected to see in the darkness and uncertain light, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the isolation and cold. But I knew better. I had felt no doubt when I saw it. The print had been real. Someone had been here. That night, as the darkness came again and I was settling in front of the fire with fresh blankets, I realized something else. The generator had not failed. I had not checked it carefully in the shed. I had simply assumed the tank was empty because it was quiet. But what if someone had turned it off? What if someone had deliberately stopped it, knowing that the darkness would force me outside, or that the cold would drive me to desperation? What if someone had wanted it to fail? I did not sleep that night. I fed the fire and watched the windows and listened to every sound the cabin made. The wind moved around the eaves. Snow shifted on the roof. The fire crackled. And underneath it all, there was a quality to the silence that made me think I was listening for something specific, something that was out there waiting for the right moment. On the third day without the generator, I forced myself to check the shed again. I needed to know. I needed to understand what had happened. The fuel tank stood in the darkness, and I shined the flashlight into the opening. The tank was not empty. It was 3/4 full. I stood there and felt something break inside me. The tank was full. The generator should have been running. Someone had turned it off deliberately, and I had been too panicked, too afraid, to check carefully enough in my fear. Someone had come to the cabin while I was inside. Someone had gone into the shed. Someone had stopped the generator and then walked away into the snow. I restarted the generator with numb hands, and the familiar hum began again, and the lights inside the cabin flickered on, and nothing had changed except everything. The lights and the heat meant nothing now. Someone knew where I was. Someone had demonstrated that they could access the shed, the generator, could move around the cabin while I slept or panicked inside. I tried the phone. No dial tone. The lines were down, as I had suspected they might be. I checked my car. It started, but the roads were still impassable, and driving in this darkness with the snow falling meant driving blind, meant risking going into a ditch where no one would find me. I was not safe for leaving, but I was not safe staying either. I locked every door. I made sure every window was closed. I kept every light in the cabin on, and I did not sleep. The generator hummed, and I listened beneath that sound for other sounds, for the crunch of snow under footsteps, for the sound of someone trying a door or testing a window. By the 4th day of this, I had stopped trying to convince myself that any of this was normal. Someone was out there. Someone had been here. Someone was watching the cabin, and I did not know why, and I could not leave, and no one knew where I was. That evening, as the darkness came again, I found something on the porch. It was a note, just a piece of paper, weighted down with a stone, positioned so that I would see it if I looked out the front window. I did not want to go outside to get it. I stood at the window for a long time, staring at that pale rectangle against the snow, knowing that retrieving it meant opening the door, meant being exposed for even a few seconds to whoever was out there. I opened the door quickly and grabbed the paper and locked the door again, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The note had no signature. It contained only a few words, written in careful block letters. It read, "I know you are here alone. I know no one is coming. Come find me when you are ready." I burned the note in the fireplace, but the words remained in my mind. Come find me? Not a threat. Exactly. An invitation. A challenge. A statement of fact that whoever had left it knew more about my situation than I did. Knew that I was trapped here. Knew that my only option would eventually be to leave. On the 5th day, without understanding, I stood at the window and realized that the snow had stopped. The sky was clearing. By tomorrow, the roads would become passable. By tomorrow, I could drive out of here and get back to civilization and never think about this place again. But the note had said to find them, and some part of me, some part one did not recognize, wanted to. I do not know what happened after that moment. I remember looking out at the forest beyond the cabin, at the trees that stretched back into darkness even though the sun was beginning to set. I remember feeling a pull toward that darkness, a sense that something out there was waiting for me to make a decision. I remember the cold moving in again, even though the generator was running, even though the fire was burning. I remember knowing that I was no longer alone in the cabin. Whether I left that night or the next morning, I cannot say. Whether the person who had written the note came inside, or whether I went out to find them, I cannot remember. The time between that moment and my arrival back in the city 3 days later is a blank space in my memory, a darkness that does not resolve even now. Months later, sitting in my apartment in the middle of the day with every light on. What I do remember is driving back toward civilization on roads that seemed wrong somehow, following signs that did not quite match the landscape, and the growing certainty that something had changed. That the person sitting in my car was not entirely the same person who had arrived at that cabin a week before. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet and the darkness presses against my windows, I hear it. That low hum, that familiar sound that should be impossible, that should be thousands of miles away, buried in snow in a cabin I can no longer locate on any map. The generator is running again, and I am listening for footsteps on my porch. Story 6. Cabin that appeared. The second cabin was not there yesterday. I am certain of this because I had walked that exact path through the woods every morning since I arrived. The same route, the same trees, the same frozen creek bed that runs along the northern edge of the property. I knew every landmark, every fallen branch, every turn. There had never been another structure within sight. But this morning, there it was. I noticed it through the trees while making my usual loop, a dark shape that did not belong. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows playing across the snow in a way that created the illusion of walls and a roof. But as I got closer, the illusion solidified into something real. A cabin, almost identical to the one I was renting. Same size, same dark wood, same covered porch. It sat perhaps 200 yards from my place, separated by dense forest and a small clearing I had never seen before. The snow around it was pristine, untouched. No tire tracks, no footprints, no smoke from the chimney. Just the building itself, sitting there as if it had always existed. The fear came slowly, not a sudden rush, but a creeping wrongness that settled in my stomach as I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. This far into the wilderness, cabins do not simply appear. There are property lines, there are records, there are signs of construction, disturbed earth, cut trees, access roads. There was nothing, just the cabin and the silence and the terrible certainty that something was very wrong. I had come here for isolation, 3 weeks alone to clear my head after the divorce, after losing the house, after everything fell apart in ways I had not seen coming. My brother owned this property. He had offered it freely, knowing I needed distance from everything familiar. He had assured me I would be completely alone out here. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. The nearest town was 30. He had never mentioned a second cabin. I pulled out my phone to call him, then remembered there was no signal this deep in the forest. The nearest cell tower was too far away. I had known this before coming. I had wanted it, the complete disconnection, the forced quiet. Now that disconnection felt like a trap. I walked back to my cabin quickly, my boots crunching through frozen snow, my breath coming in visible clouds. Inside, I tried the landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall. I had used it once when I arrived to let my brother know I had made it safely. The line had worked fine then. Now there was no dial tone, just silence. I hung up and tried again. Nothing. The phone was completely dead. I told myself it was the storm that had passed through 2 nights ago. Downed line somewhere between here and civilization. Nothing sinister, just bad timing. The phone would work again soon. Or I would drive out to town and call from there. There were explanations, rational reasons for everything. But I could not shake the image of that second cabin sitting in the woods where nothing had been before. I tried to work. I had brought my laptop and several books, intending to spend the time reading and writing and thinking. But concentration was impossible. Every few minutes I found myself at the window, looking out toward where I knew the other cabin sat hidden among the trees. By afternoon I had convinced myself to go back, to examine it more closely, to find some evidence that would explain its presence. Maybe it had been there all along and I had somehow missed it. Maybe my daily walks had not been as consistent as I thought. Maybe the isolation was already affecting my perception. I put on my coat and gloves and walked back through the woods. The cabin was still there, solid, real, undeniable. I approached it slowly, my boots breaking the perfect surface of the snow around it. When I reached the porch, I stopped and listened. No sound from inside, no movement. I climbed the 3 steps to the door and knocked. The sound echoed flatly in the cold air. No response. I tried the door handle. Locked. I moved to the nearest window and cupped my hands against the glass to peer inside. The interior was dark, but I could make out shapes. Furniture, a wood stove, a kitchen area. The layout was nearly identical to my cabin. Same floor plan, same basic setup, but something was off. The furniture was positioned wrong. Or maybe it was positioned exactly right, like a mirror image. Everything reversed. The stove on the opposite wall, the kitchen on the other side, the bedroom door in the wrong place. I stepped back from the window and walked around the cabin, checking each side. No power lines, no propane tank, no woodpile, no signs of recent occupancy. The windows were clean, but the glass had that old, thick quality. The porch boards were weathered but showed no signs of rot. It looked like it had been here for decades, but it had not been here yesterday. I walked back to my cabin as the light started to fade. The winter sun drops fast this time of year, and by 4:30 the shadows were already long and deep. I locked the door behind me and started a fire in the wood stove. Then I sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly. There had to be an explanation. Maybe my brother had forgotten about the second cabin. Maybe it was old, abandoned, overgrown. Maybe I had simply missed it somehow. The human mind is fallible. Memory is unreliable. Stress and isolation can distort perception. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew I was lying. I had walked that path every single day. I knew every tree, every stone. The cabin had not been there, which meant it had appeared. And that was impossible. Night came on fast and complete. The darkness out here is absolute. No light pollution. No distant glow from towns or highways. Just blackness pressing against the windows. I kept the fire burning and turned on every lamp in the cabin. The light felt thin, inadequate. Around 8 I made dinner. Canned soup heated on the camp stove. I ate without tasting it, standing at the sink, watching the window above it. My reflection stared back at me, distorted and strange in the old glass. Behind my reflection, I could see only darkness. Then I saw the light. It was faint, distant, coming from the direction of the other cabin. I turned off the kitchen lamp to see better. The light was steady, yellow, like lamplight through a window. Someone was inside the other cabin. My heart started beating harder. I had not heard a car, had not seen anyone arrive, but someone was there now. Close enough to see, close enough to reach. I should have felt relieved. Another person, an explanation, someone who could tell me what was happening. Instead, I felt a deep, instinctive dread. I watched the light for a long time. It did not move, did not flicker, just stayed steady and still. After perhaps 30 minutes, it went out. The darkness returned, complete, total. I stood at the window for another hour, watching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Finally, exhaustion forced me to the bedroom. I did not sleep well. My mind kept circling back to that light, to the cabin that should not exist, to the growing certainty that I was not alone anymore. When morning came, gray and cold, I decided to go back. To knock on the door again, to find whoever had been there and demand answers. I walked through the woods to the clearing. The cabin was still there, but something had changed. There were footprints now, leading from the tree line to the porch, then back again. Someone had walked the same path I was walking. The boot prints were large, adult-sized, recent enough that the snow had not yet filled them in, but the tracks did not come from any direction I recognized. They seemed to emerge from deeper in the forest, from an area I had never explored. And they did not circle back. They simply stopped at the tree line, as if whoever made them had vanished. I followed the path to the porch and knocked. Louder this time, more insistent. No response. I tried the door handle. Still locked. I moved to the window and looked inside again. Everything was the same as before. Dark, empty, mirrored, except now there was something on the table. Something that had not been there yesterday. A lamp, unlit, sitting in the exact center of the wooden surface. The same lamp I had on my kitchen table. I stepped back from the window, my breath coming faster. That was impossible. My lamp was still in my cabin. I had seen it this morning, but the lamp in that window looked identical. Same brass base, same glass shade, same everything. I ran back to my cabin. I did not slow down until I was inside with the door locked behind me. I went straight to the kitchen table. The lamp was gone. I searched every room, every surface. It was not there. The lamp that had sat on my kitchen table for the past week, that I had used every evening, was gone. And it was sitting inside the other cabin. The fear I had been fighting finally took hold. This was not stress, not confusion, not isolation playing tricks. Something was wrong in a way I could not explain or understand. I spent the rest of the day inside, checking and rechecking the doors and windows. I tried the phone repeatedly. Still dead. I considered leaving, getting in my truck and driving out. But the road had been bad when I arrived, and the storm had made it worse. Without knowing the phone worked, without any way to call for help if I got stuck, leaving felt more dangerous than staying. As darkness fell again, I built up the fire and tried to convince myself I would be fine. I would wait out the rest of the week. Then I would leave whether the road was good or not. Around 9 I saw the light again. Same window, same steady glow. This time I made myself walk outside. I needed to confront this, to see who was there and understand what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself out the door. The cold hit me immediately. Below zero, the kind of cold that burns exposed skin. I turned on the flashlight and followed the path through the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating snow and tree trunks in my own clouded breath. When I reached the clearing, I stopped. The other cabin was dark. No light in any window. No glow from inside, but I had just seen it. Not 2 minutes ago, I had watched the light from my window before deciding to investigate. I crossed the clearing anyway, climbed the porch, and knocked. The sound seemed too loud in the frozen silence. No response. I tried the handle. Locked. I moved to the window where I had seen the lamp. I shined my flashlight through the glass. The lamp was gone. The table was empty. I returned to my cabin, moving quickly, fighting the urge to run. Inside, I locked the door and went to the kitchen. The lamp was back on the table. I stood staring at it for a long time, my mind refusing to process what was happening. Objects do not move between buildings on their own. Buildings do not appear where they did not exist. Lights do not turn on in empty cabins. Unless they are not empty. That night I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the fire burning and every light on, watching the windows. Around 3 in the morning I saw movement outside. A shadow passing between the trees. Too large to be an animal. Moving too deliberately to be anything natural. I turned off the lights and watched from the darkness. The shadow moved to the edge of the clearing and stopped. It stood there, perfectly still, for perhaps 5 minutes. Then it moved again, circling around the cabin. I ran to each window, tracking it. When it reached the back of the cabin, it stopped again. Then it started walking toward my door. I grabbed the fireplace poker, the only thing resembling a weapon, and stood facing the entrance. The footsteps were heavy on the porch. They crossed from one end to the other, then back. Then they stopped directly in front of the door. The handle turned, slowly, testing. The door held. Minutes passed. The handle did not move again. But I could feel something on the other side. A presence, waiting. Eventually the footsteps moved away. I watched through the window as the shadow retreated into the forest, back toward where the other cabin sat hidden in darkness. When dawn came, I went outside to check the porch. There were footprints, fresh, large boot treads. They came from the woods, crossed the porch, then returned the same way. But the tracks did not match the ones I had seen yesterday. The tread pattern was different. These were newer, deeper. I followed them into the forest. They led directly to the other cabin, up the porch steps, and stopped at the front door. Then they continued inside. The door was still locked, but the tracks went through it, through the solid wood, into the cabin. I tried the handle again. Locked. I looked through the window. The interior was too dark to see clearly, but I thought I saw movement. Something shifting in the shadows. I backed away and returned to my cabin. I started throwing clothes and supplies into my bag. I was leaving. Road conditions did not matter anymore. I would drive as far as I could and walk the rest if necessary. But when I went to the door, I could not open it. The handle turned, the lock disengaged, but the door would not move. It was not stuck. It was not blocked. It simply would not open. Like something on the other side was holding it closed. I tried the back door. Same thing. The windows were all locked and would not budge. I was trapped inside. That was 2 days ago. Or maybe 3. Time has started to feel wrong. The sun rises and sets, but the intervals between seem inconsistent. Too long or too short. I have lost track. The phone is still dead. The doors still will not open. I have plenty of food and firewood. I am not in immediate danger. But every night, the light appears in the other cabin. And every night, something walks circles around my cabin. The footprints in the snow multiply. Different treads, different sizes, too many to count now. And this morning, when I looked out the window, I saw something that made me finally understand. The other cabin is closer than it was yesterday. Not by much, maybe 10 feet. But it has moved. The distance between us is shrinking. I can see more details now. The weathered boards, the stone chimney, the windows reflecting the morning light. And in one of those windows, I can see a figure. Standing, watching my cabin. It looks like me. Tonight the light will come on again. The footsteps will circle. The distance will close. And eventually, I think, the 2 cabins will meet. I think that is what happens here. Why the second cabin appeared. Why the doors will not open. Why my lamp moved and the figure in the window wears my face. There is someone in there. Someone who arrived at a cabin in the woods seeking isolation. Someone who walked the same paths and knew every tree and stone. Someone who woke up one morning and saw a second cabin through the trees where nothing had been before. Someone who is exactly where I am now, watching their world collapse into something impossible and terrifying, waiting for the darkness to close in completely. I think I am not the first person to rent this cabin. And I think they are all still here, trapped in versions of the same place, getting closer to each other, narrowing the distance until we finally meet. The sun is setting again. The light will come on soon in the other cabin. I will watch it like I do every night now. And tomorrow morning, when I look out the window, the cabin will be closer still. Isolation changes the way the mind interprets sound, movement, and time. Story 7. Knocking from outside. The knocking started at 2 in the morning, and it was the most patient sound I have ever heard. I was awake when it began, not sleeping, just lying in the darkness of the motel room, listening to the wind move across the parking lot outside. I had stopped in this small town because the snow had become too heavy to drive through safely. The highway behind me had disappeared into white, and the next town was still 40 miles ahead. The motel was the only reasonable choice. The knock was soft, almost polite. 3 taps, evenly spaced, against what I assumed was the window near the front door. I did not move. There was nothing threatening about the sound itself. It was measured and calm, the kind of knock that suggested someone simply wanted attention, wanted to be let in from the cold. But there was something underneath it that made my body go still. Something about the patience implied by that sound. The certainty that whoever was out there in the winter darkness expected no response, or expected that I would eventually answer. I waited. The wind continued its work against the building. The motel room was dark except for the thin line of light from the highway sign outside, bleeding through a gap in the curtains. Then it came again. 3 knocks, same spacing, same quiet intensity. I turned my head toward the window, though I could see nothing. The curtains were thick and yellowed with age. The room smelled like old cigarettes and the particular loneliness that only a roadside motel in winter can contain. I told myself it was probably another guest, confused about their room number. Happens all the time in places like this. Drunk people, tired people, people whose minds are not quite working correctly after hours of driving or drinking or both. Nothing strange about it, but the knock came again. 3 taps, waiting. The patience in that sound was absolute. I got out of bed and moved toward the door. I did not turn on the light. I simply stood there in the darkness, about 5 feet away from it, and I listened. For a long time, there was nothing. Just the wind, just the ambient hum of the motel, the heating system, the distant sound of the highway beyond the building. Then the knock came once more. Still patient, still from the same location, the window area near the door. Still 3 taps. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway outside was dark. The motel had not bothered to install adequate lighting. I could see the vague outline of the wall across from my door, nothing more. I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The parking lot visible through the glass doors at the end of the corridor was white and still and completely devoid of any living thing. The snow was falling in that way that makes distance collapse, the flakes coming down so thick that the vehicles in the lot became suggestions rather than solid objects. I stepped back into my room and closed the door. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. There was no reason for it. An empty hallway meant nothing. Perhaps someone had gone back to their room. Perhaps the knocking had come from a different door and I had simply misidentified the source. I went back to bed and pulled the blankets up around me. The knocking did not resume that night. I lay there until the sky began to lighten, until the darkness outside the window transformed into the gray of pre-dawn snow, and nothing else disturbed the silence. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it, or that it had been some other guest, and that I had allowed the isolation and the late hour and the strangeness of being alone in a motel in the middle of a blizzard to make me afraid of something completely ordinary. I was wrong. The next night, the knocking came again. Same time, 2 o'clock in the morning. 3 taps against the window. Patient, deliberate, waiting. This time, I did not leave the bed. I lay there and listened to it repeat. Once, twice, a third time. Each sequence of 3 knocks separated by perhaps 30 seconds of silence. As if whoever was out there was not demanding entry, but simply confirming that I was still here, still awake, still listening. After the 5th sequence, the knocking stopped. I did not sleep. I lay awake until the sun came up, and I thought about leaving. The road was probably passable by now. The snow had stopped falling during the night. I could pack my things and drive out of this place and put distance between myself and whatever was happening here. But I did not leave. I told myself it was because the roads would still be slick, because driving tired after a night without sleep would be more dangerous than staying. I told myself that I was being rational, logical, that I had no reason to believe anything was wrong beyond a strange coincidence of knocking sounds in the night. But the truth was that some part of me wanted to see what would happen. Some part of me needed to understand. The knock came the 3rd night at the same time. I had been waiting for it, actually awake and aware, and when it came it was exactly as I remembered. 3 taps, patient and certain. The sound of someone who knew I was inside, who knew I was listening, and who had all the time in the world. This time, I got up. This time, I moved toward the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. The parking lot beyond was dark. But I could see something in the snow. A trail of footprints, leading from the far end of the parking lot toward the motel, toward my section of rooms. The prints stopped directly in front of my door. I stood there in the freezing cold that poured in from the open door, and I stared at those footprints. They were fresh. The snow inside them was undisturbed, crisp, recent. Someone had walked from the parking lot to my room sometime during the evening or night. Someone had stood at my window and knocked 3 times, and then had walked back out into the darkness. Or perhaps had not left at all. I closed the door and locked it, and I checked the windows. All closed, all locked, no indication of any attempt to enter beyond the knocking. The footprints showed that someone had approached. The locked doors showed that no one had come in, which meant they were still outside, waiting. I packed my things in the darkness. I did not turn on the lights. I just gathered my belongings by the light of the highway sign, moving quietly, methodically, with my mind focused on a single goal. I was leaving. I was getting in my car and driving out of this place, and whatever was happening here would have to happen without me. I checked the parking lot from the window before I went out. The snow was empty. The footprints had been covered by the fresh snow that had begun falling again. There was no sign of anyone waiting, no indication of danger. I opened the door and walked to my car, my keys in my hand, my bag slung over my shoulder. The cold hit me like a physical thing, and the wind was strong enough to make walking difficult. I did not look around. I just kept my eyes on my car and moved toward it. I was 10 feet away when the knocking sound came again. Not from my room this time, from somewhere else, somewhere close. 3 taps, patient, waiting. I got in my car and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I put the key in the ignition. The engine started. The headlights cut through the darkness and the snow, illuminating the strange empty landscape of the motel parking lot. In the beam of those headlights, I saw nothing unusual. Just the motel building, just the snow, just the darkness beyond. I drove out of that parking lot faster than was safe on snow-covered pavement, and I did not look back. The highway was mostly clear. The snow had stopped falling. I drove for 3 hours straight without stopping, without thinking, just moving forward with the certainty that distance meant safety, that leaving meant escape. But by the time I reached the next town, the sun was rising, and I realized something terrible. I did not remember driving. I did not remember the curves in the road or the towns I passed through or any of the journey. It was as if I had lost time, as if some portion of the night had simply disappeared. I pulled over at a gas station and looked at my clock. Impossible. Impossible that I had covered that distance in the time that had passed since I left the motel. The gas station attendant was young, maybe early 20s, and he glanced up at me with the blank expression of someone who had been working the night shift too long. I asked him what time he had come on shift. He said 4 o'clock in the morning. I asked him if he had seen a car that looked like mine come through. He did not remember. I paid for gas and I drove on, and I told myself that I was being irrational. That stress and fear had simply made the drive feel shorter than it actually was. That my perception of time had been distorted by the late hour and the darkness and the strange events of the night. But the knocking has followed me. It comes from different places now. From the walls of my apartment. From the windows of my office. From the passenger door of my car when I am driving at night. Always the same pattern. 3 taps. Patient. Deliberate. The sound of something that knows exactly where I am and has all the time in the world to wait. I have not told anyone about this. They would think I was losing my mind. And perhaps I am. Perhaps the isolation of that motel room, the strangeness of that night, has broken something in my perception that cannot be fixed. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Those footprints in the snow were real. The knocking is real. And sometimes, in the moments before sleep, I wonder if the person who was knocking at that motel window ever actually left. I wonder if I am the only one who can hear it because they came inside with me. Because they have been traveling in the empty space behind my perception since that night, waiting for the right moment, patient and certain as they always are. 3 taps, waiting, never demanding, never threatening, just patient, just certain that eventually, I will understand. Eventually, I will open the door, and whatever is on the other side will finally come in. Story 8, radio turned on by itself. The radio came on at exactly 2 in the morning, and I knew without checking that I hadn't left it plugged in. I had been alone in my grandfather's hunting cabin for 3 days, buried under a January blizzard that had closed every road within 30 miles. The isolation was supposed to help me clear my head after everything that happened. The job, the marriage, the slow unraveling of a life I thought was stable. But now, lying in the darkness with snow hammering against the windows, I listened to that radio crackle to life with a sound that made my skin go cold. Static first, then a voice, a man speaking in measured tones, calm and professional, like an old emergency broadcast. This is a severe weather warning for residents of Timber County. Conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Do not attempt to travel. Do not leave your shelter. Stay inside. Stay warm. This message will repeat. The voice stopped. The static continued for exactly 10 seconds. Then the message started again, word for word, in the same tone, with the same pauses. I sat up in bed, my breath visible in the cold air. The cabin's heating system had been struggling since the power went out yesterday afternoon. I had been relying on the wood stove in the main room, but even that couldn't push warmth into the bedroom where I slept. The radio sat on a shelf in the main room, an old tube radio my grandfather had kept since the 60s. Its wooden case cracked and faded. I hadn't touched it since I arrived, hadn't even thought about it. The thing hadn't worked in years, but now it was broadcasting, clear and strong, the same warning, over and over. I got out of bed and pulled on my jacket over the clothes I had been sleeping in. My hands were already numb. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped at least 20 degrees since nightfall. I walked into the main room. The wood stove still glowed faintly, but the fire inside had burned down to coals. I should have fed it before bed, should have kept it going. The radio sat exactly where it always had, on the shelf above the counter. Its dial glowed a soft amber, the only light in the room besides the dying fire. The voice continued its loop. Do not attempt to travel. Do not leave your shelter. Stay inside. Stay warm. I walked closer. The radio's power cord hung loose, unplugged, the end dangling 6 inches above the floor. My throat tightened. I reached out and touched the radio, this wooden case. Warm. Not hot, but warmer than the freezing air around it. As if it had been running for hours, I turned the dial to off, clicked it firmly into place. The voice continued. This is a severe weather warning for residents of Timber County. I unplugged the antenna wire from the back, pulled it completely free. The broadcast didn't stop. I stood there in the near darkness, watching that amber dial glow, listening to the same message repeat every 30 seconds with mechanical precision. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind drove snow against the windows so hard it sounded like sand. The entire cabin shook with each gust. I went back to the bedroom and grabbed my phone. No signal. There hadn't been signal since the storm started. But I tried anyway, some part of me hoping that maybe now, at 2 a.m, with an impossible radio broadcasting from a dead device, maybe the world would connect again. Nothing. I returned to the main room. The message continued its loop. I counted 30 seconds. Every time. Not 29, not 31. Exactly 30 seconds between the end of one broadcast and the beginning of the next. I opened the wood stove and added 2 logs, watching the coals flare as oxygen fed them. The fire caught quickly, pushing back some of the cold. But the warmth felt wrong now, insufficient, as if the cabin itself were rejecting heat. I sat down in the chair closest to the stove and stared at the radio. Tried to think of logical explanations. Battery backup. Some old radios had battery compartments. Maybe my grandfather had left batteries inside decades ago, and somehow they still held a charge. I stood and examined the radio's back panel. No battery compartment, no hidden power source, just the unplugged cord and the disconnected antenna. Emergency broadcast system. Maybe some kind of automatic signal that activated during severe weather, powerful enough to induce current in old electronics. But the message was too specific, too local, and the voice sounded wrong. Not modern, not digital. It had the quality of old recordings, the kind with tape hiss and analog warmth. I went to the window and looked outside. Nothing but white. The snow had piled 3 feet high against the glass, and more fell constantly, driven sideways by wind that howled through the trees. No one was coming to check on me. No one even knew I was here. I had driven up alone, told no one my plans. Just needed space, just needed silence. Now I had too much of both. The radio continued its warning. Stay inside, stay warm. This message will repeat. I walked back to the shelf and grabbed the radio. It was heavier than I expected, solid and dense. I carried it to the front door, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled. The door opened 6 inches before hitting a wall of snow. The drift had built up against the entire front of the cabin, packed solid by the storm. I tried to shove the radio through the gap, to throw it outside where it could freeze and die. But my hands wouldn't move. My arms locked. Some instinct deeper than thought stopped me. The cold pouring through that 6-inch gap was unlike anything I had felt before. Not just freezing, something worse. The kind of cold that makes your bones ache, that makes your lungs seize, that makes you understand how quickly a body can fail. I pulled the door shut and locked it, set the radio back on the shelf. The broadcast continued without interruption. I spent the next hour feeding the fire and trying to ignore the voice. But ignoring it was impossible. The repetition worked its way into my thoughts, each loop eroding my certainty a little more. Why this message? Why now? Why a warning to stay inside when I was already trapped? At 3 in the morning, something changed. The message ended as usual. The 10 seconds of static began. Then a new voice spoke. A woman this time, younger, less professional. She sounded tired, frightened. If you, rehearing this, stay away from the windows. Don, to look outside. Don, to respond to any sounds. Now what do you think they are? Then static. Then the original message resumed. This is a severe weather warning for residents of Timber County. I stood frozen in the middle of the room. My heart hammered against my ribs. The woman, this voice had been different. More immediate, like she was broadcasting from somewhere close. Somewhere in the storm. I waited through 3 more loops of the original message. The woman didn't to return. But now I was aware of the windows in a way I hadn't been before. 3 of them in the main room. 1 in the bedroom, all facing the forest, all covered with snow, but not completely. Small gaps remained where I could still see out if I looked carefully. I had looked out dozens of times since arriving. Watched the storm, watched the trees bend in the wind. Normal things, expected things. Now the windows felt like threats. I moved to the center of the room, equal distance from all of them. The fire crackled, the radio droned, the wind screamed, and beneath those sounds, something else. Soft, rhythmic, like footsteps in snow. I held my breath and listened. There, again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My hands started shaking. I told myself it was the cold. Just the cold. The footsteps continued, around the left side of the cabin, past the bedroom window, along the back wall, moving toward the front. I stared at the door. The deadbolt was secure. The door was solid. Nothing could get through. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front entrance. Silence. Just the wind and the radio and the fire. Then 3 knocks. Slow, heavy, patient. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. 3 more knocks. Same rhythm. Same weight. The radio continued its loop. Do not leave your shelter. Stay inside. Stay warm. The knocks came again. 3 times. Then stopped. I waited. Counted seconds. Got to 300 before I allowed myself to move. I crept to the window beside the door and looked through the small gap in the snow. Nothing. Just white darkness and falling flakes. No footprints. No shapes. No sign that anything had been there. But I had heard it. The footsteps. The knocks. As real as my own heartbeat. I backed away from the window. Returned to the chair by the fire. Fed more wood into the stove even though it didn't need it. The radio entered another loop. This time, after the static, a third voice emerged. A man, older, his words slurred slightly, like he was struggling to speak. Don, to trust the warmth. It is lying to you. The cold is safer. The cold is honest. Then silence. Then the original broadcast resumed. I stood and touched my face. My skin was cold, but I was sweating. 3 different voices now, 3 different warnings, none of them making sense. All of them terrifying in their specificity. I grabbed the radio and smashed it against the floor. The wooden case splintered. The dial cracked. The internal components scattered across the room. The voice continued broadcasting from the broken pieces. This is a severe weather warning for residents of Timber County. I gathered the fragments and threw them into the fire. The voice didn't stop. It continued from the flames, distorted now but still clear. Do not attempt to travel. Do not leave your shelter. I slammed the stove door shut. The voice kept going, muffled but present, speaking from inside the fire, from inside the metal, from inside the cabin itself. I ran to the bedroom and climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets over my head like a frightened thing. But I could still hear it, faint but insistent. Stay inside, stay warm. The hours that followed blurred together. I drifted in and out of sleep, never sure which state I was in. The voice continued without pause. Sometimes the original message, sometimes the warnings from the other voices, sometimes sounds I couldn't identify. Breathing, scraping, something that might have been crying. When gray light finally filtered through the snow-covered windows, I got up and checked the stove. The fire had burned out completely. The metal was cold to the touch, but the voice still emanated from somewhere inside it. I tried to leave in, tried to dig through the snow blocking the front door, but for every handful I removed, more seemed to take its place. The storm had sealed me inside as thoroughly as concrete. The radio's message played constantly now. No more loops, no more pauses, just an endless stream of voices overlapping, all of them warning, all of them afraid. I understood then what my grandfather had never told me. Why he stopped coming to the cabin. Why he never mentioned it in his final years. Why he left me this place in his will with no explanation. The cabin wasn't abandoned. It was quarantined. Some winters ago, something had happened here, something that left an echo in the walls, in the air, in the old electronics that should have stayed dormant. And now that echo had found someone new to speak to. I sit by the dead fire now, listening to the voices. There are dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all saying different things, all warning about different dangers, all begging me to do contradictory things. The storm outside hasn't stopped. The snow is above the windows now. The cabin is buried. My phone died 2 days ago. Or maybe it was yesterday. Time feels negotiable here. The voices keep telling me to stay inside. But I don't think I could leave even if I wanted to. Sometimes I think I hear my own voice among the others, warning someone who hasn't arrived yet. Someone who will come here looking for peace and find only this. The radio is still in pieces in the cold stove, but the broadcast never ends. And somewhere in the static between warnings, I can hear footsteps. Still circling, still patient, still waiting for me to open the door. Some cabins are quiet for a reason, and others never truly are. Story 9. Ice that grew inward. The window froze from the inside first. I noticed it on the third morning, standing in the kitchen with my coffee, looking out at the white expanse of forest and snow. A thin layer of frost had formed on the interior surface of the glass, delicate crystals spreading in patterns that caught the early light. I reached out to touch it and felt cold radiating through, not from outside, from the glass itself. This was wrong. Windows freeze on the outside when cold air meets warm glass. They do not freeze from within, not unless the temperature inside is colder than the temperature outside, and the cabin was warm. I had kept the wood stove burning since I arrived. The air around me was comfortable, almost too warm, but the frost was there, growing, spreading across the glass in branching patterns that looked almost intentional. I wiped at it with my sleeve. The crystals came away easily, melting against the fabric. I could see outside again. The forest stood silent and still under fresh snow. No movement, no wind. The morning was unnaturally quiet. By that afternoon, the frost had returned. Thicker this time. I wiped it away again and turned up the wood stove, feeding it more logs than necessary. The cabin grew warmer, almost uncomfortably so, but the frost continued to form on the inside of that kitchen window. Then it spread to the window above the sink, then to the living room window facing west. The isolation had been my choice. After the layoff, after the divorce papers were signed, after my daughter stopped returning my calls, I needed distance from everything. My brother owned this hunting cabin in northern Michigan, 70 miles from the nearest real town. He had offered it without hesitation. No rent, no timeline, just space and silence and time to figure out what came next. I had been here 6 days. The first 5 had been exactly what I needed. Quiet, simple, a chance to think without the constant noise of my previous life pressing in from all sides. But something had changed. I felt it the way you feel a storm coming, that pressure in the air that precedes darkness. The frost was just the beginning. That night I woke to the sound of ice cracking. Sharp, sudden, like a tree branch snapping in the cold. I sat up in bed, disoriented, my breath visible in the air despite the fire I had banked before sleeping. The bedroom was freezing, colder than it should have been, colder than was possible with the stove still burning in the main room. I got up and walked to the bedroom window. The glass was completely covered in frost now. Not just a thin layer, a thick, opaque coating that blocked all view of the outside. I touched it and pulled my hand back immediately. The glass was painfully cold, cold enough to burn. I went to the main room. The fire was still going, red coals glowing in the stove. But every window in the cabin was frosted over from the inside. The patterns were more elaborate now, more complex. They looked almost like writing, like symbols or letters in a language I did not recognize. I turned on every light in the cabin and checked the doors. Both were locked from the inside, exactly as I had left them. I looked through the peephole in the front door. More frost. I could not see outside. The fear came quietly, not a sudden panic, but a slow realization that something was very wrong and I had no way to understand or fix it. I spent the rest of the night feeding the fire, trying to warm the cabin, trying to melt the ice that should not exist. The temperature inside rose until sweat ran down my back, but the frost remained, growing thicker, spreading. By morning, I could not see outside at all. Every window was completely opaque with ice that grew from within. I tried scraping it away with a butter knife. The ice was harder than it should have been. Not brittle, almost solid. When I finally managed to clear a small section, I found another layer underneath. And another beneath that. The ice was not just on the surface. It was in the glass, growing through it somehow. I stepped back and looked at the window. Really looked at it. and saw something that made my stomach drop. The ice patterns were not random. They formed shapes, outlines, silhouettes of things I could almost recognize. Trees, branches, and something else, something that might have been a person. Standing, watching. I cleared every window I could reach, scraping until my hands ached. But the ice always returned, faster each time, and the shapes and the patterns became clearer. There were figures in the ice, multiple figures, standing at different distances, all facing inward, all watching the cabin. I told myself I was seeing patterns where none existed. The mind finds faces in random noise. Everyone knows this. It means nothing, but the figures moved, not quickly, not obviously, but each time I looked away and looked back, they were closer. The shapes pressed nearer to the glass, more defined, more detailed. I needed to leave. This thought came with absolute clarity. I needed to get out of this cabin immediately. The isolation had become something else, something dangerous. I was not thinking clearly. The fear was growing into paranoia. I needed to be around other people, in a place with heat and light and rational explanations for impossible things. I packed my bag quickly, throwing in clothes and supplies without thinking. I pulled on my coat and boots and went to the front door. I unlocked it and pulled. The door would not open. I pulled harder. Nothing. Not stuck. Not frozen. Simply immovable. Like it was sealed shut from the outside. I tried the back door. Same result. I tried every window, attempting to force them open. They were all frozen closed. Not by ice on the hinges. They simply would not move. Would not budge. Would not respond to any force I applied. I was sealed inside. The panic I had been fighting finally broke through. I threw myself against the front door. I hit it with my shoulder again and again until pain forced me to stop. The door did not even rattle. It might as well have been a solid wall. I grabbed my phone to call for help and saw what I already knew. No signal. There had never been a signal this far into the forest. That was the point. The isolation. The disconnection. I tried the landline mounted on the kitchen wall. Dead. Just silence. I was alone. Trapped. With no way to communicate and no way to leave. The cabin felt smaller suddenly. The walls closer. The air thinner. I forced myself to breathe slowly. To think. There had to be an explanation. Doors do not seal themselves. Windows do not freeze from within. This was a malfunction. A mechanical problem. Something I could understand if I stayed calm. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew I was lying. This was not mechanical. This was something else. I spent hours examining every inch of the cabin, looking for weak points, for ways out. There were none. The windows would not break. I hit them with a chair and the chair broke instead. The glass did not even crack. The doors were similarly impossible, solid and immovable. As darkness fell, the temperature inside the cabin dropped. Not gradually, suddenly. The fire still burned but provided no heat. My breath clouded thick in the air. Frost began forming on the interior walls, on the furniture, on my hands when I held them still too long. The cabin was becoming the outside. The barrier between inside and out was dissolving. I wrapped myself in every blanket I could find and sat near the stove, watching the flames and trying to understand. The frost on the windows grew thicker. The patterns became clearer, the figures more defined. There were dozens of them now, pressed against the glass, detailed enough that I could see faces, expressions. They were not moving anymore. They were just there, watching, waiting, and they all looked like me. Not exactly, but close enough. Same build, same features, variations on a theme, like photographs of the same person taken at different times. Different angles, different moments. I stood and approached the nearest window. The figure on the other side tilted its head, mirroring my movement. I raised my hand. It raised its hand. Then it smiled, and I had not smiled. I backed away. The figure remained pressed against the glass, its smile widening. Too wide. The other figures began to move. Slowly, their hands touching the glass, their breath fogging the ice from the other side. Except there was no other side. The ice was growing from within. They were inside the glass, inside the frost, inside the barrier between me and the world. I turned away and tried to think. This was not real. This could not be real. Isolation and fear were creating hallucinations. My mind was breaking under stress. I needed to sleep, to reset, to wake up and find everything normal again. But sleep felt dangerous now, like surrendering to something that had been waiting for me to let my guard down. I stayed awake through the night. The figures never moved away from the windows. They stood watching. Sometimes they shifted position. Sometimes they pressed closer. But they never left. By morning, if it was morning, I could no longer tell the time. My phone had died. The battery drained far faster than it should have. The cabin was dark despite what the clock on the wall suggested. The frost had spread to cover everything. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, thick layers of ice that glowed faintly in the dim light from the stove. The figures were clearer now. I could see details, scars, lines on faces. One of them had a scar above its left eye, the same scar I got when I was 17. Another one had a crooked finger, the same finger I broke when I was 25 and never had properly set. They were not just similar. They were me, different versions, different choices, different paths, and they all stood on the other side of the ice, looking in at this version. The one that had ended up here, alone, trapped, fading. I understood then, or thought I understood. This cabin was a place where possibilities collapsed, where all the versions converged. The isolation was not accidental. It was necessary. This was where people came when they stepped out of their lives. When they disconnected too completely. When they saw distance so absolute that they lost their anchor to reality. The cold was unbearable now. The ice covered everything. I could barely move. My fingers were numb. My thoughts slow. The figures began to step through the windows. Not breaking the glass, just passing through it like it was water. They moved slowly, deliberately, converging on where I sat by the dying fire. I tried to stand but could not. The cold had taken too much. I watched them approach. All these versions of myself. All these paths not taken. All these possibilities that had existed once and now converged on this single point. They stood around me in a circle, looking down, and I realized they were not trying to hurt me. They were not threatening. They were just there, waiting for me to join them, to step outside myself, to become another figure in the frost, another version standing at the window, looking in at whoever came next. The fire is almost out now. The cold is inside me. Part of me. I am becoming the ice, becoming the frost, becoming the thing that watches from within the glass. Soon I will stand at the window too. I will press my hands against the frost and look in at the next person who comes here seeking isolation. Who wants distance? Who steps too far from the world and finds themselves here? And I will smile, and tilt my head, and wait for them to understand. The cabin is not empty. It has never been empty. We are all still here. All the versions, all the choices, standing in the frost, growing inward, waiting for the next one to arrive. The ice forms from within because this is where we are now. Inside, between, neither here nor there, just cold and stillness and the endless watching. The fire has gone out. Story 10. They found the cabin empty. The rescue team found my cabin on the 8th day, but they never found me inside it. What they did find has no explanation. And I am the only one who understands why nothing made sense. I drove north through the winter darkness on a Friday evening, leaving behind everything that had become too heavy to carry. Work, relationships, the weight of living around people who wanted things from me. I rented a cabin in the mountains for 2 weeks. Isolated, off the grid, exactly what I needed. The cabin sat alone on a narrow road that ended 3 miles past its driveway. No neighbors, no cell service, no way for anyone to reach me unless they came to the door. This was the entire purpose. Silence, solitude, the kind of isolation that feels like breathing again after drowning in other people's demands. I arrived in darkness. The cabin was small, built of dark wood, surrounded by pine trees that blocked out most of the sky. The owner had left it prepared. Heat on, water running, a stack of firewood on the porch. I brought in my things, locked the doors, and felt something shift inside me. For the first time in months, I was alone. That first night, I did not sleep well. The silence was deeper than I expected. It pressed against the walls of the cabin like something physical. When you are accustomed to noise, to traffic and voices and the ambient hum of civilization, true silence feels wrong. It feels like the world is holding its breath. By Saturday morning, I knew something was off about the cabin. I could not have said what it was. Everything was clean. Everything was in place. The kitchen was well equipped. The fireplace worked. The heating system hummed quietly. But the air inside the cabin carried a quality that made my skin tight. It was the feeling of a place that had been waiting for something. Or someone. I told myself I was being unreasonable. The isolation was making me paranoid. This was what I had wanted, and now that I had it, I was letting my mind invent problems that did not exist. I built a fire and sat in front of it and tried to read, but I kept looking up at the windows, at the darkness beyond the glass. The forest was absolutely still. No wind, no sound of animals, just the pressing silence and the sense that something was watching from outside the circle of firelight. On Sunday, I found the inconsistencies. The cabin was smaller on the inside than it should have been on the outside. Not dramatically, not noticeably at first, but when I measured the rooms against the external walls, something did not add up. The bedroom was too small. The hallway was too short. There was a space unaccounted for, a gap between what should have been what was. When I pressed on the walls, they were solid. When I looked for hidden doors, I found nothing. I convinced myself I had misjudged the exterior dimensions. On Monday, the silence changed. It became a presence rather than an absence. It moved through the cabin like something alive. I found myself holding my breath, listening beneath the silence for something underneath it. A sound at the edge of perception, a whisper that was not quite there. I made coffee. I tried to work on my laptop. I attempted to distract myself with books and television programs I had downloaded before arriving. Nothing helped. The silence was patient and persistent and absolutely certain. That evening, I found the photographs in the kitchen drawer. They were old, the kind of prints people made before digital cameras existed. In the first photograph, a man and woman stood in front of the cabin. They were young, maybe late 20s, and they were smiling at the camera. In the second photograph, they were standing inside the cabin, in the living room where I had spent the day. Their smiles had changed. They looked different, tired, perhaps, or afraid. In the third photograph, only the woman remained. She was alone in the bedroom, standing by the window, and her face had an expression I could not read. It was not fear, exactly. It was something deeper, recognition. Perhaps, realization. There were no more photographs after that. I should have left. I should have packed my car immediately and driven away and never come back. But I did not. I put the photographs back in the drawer, and I told myself they were just left behind by previous renters. That they meant nothing, that I was looking for patterns that did not exist. But I knew better. I knew those photographs were a message, a warning, a statement of something that happened in this cabin that the cabin itself was showing me. On Tuesday, I could not find the door to the bedroom. The hallway was the same. The walls were the same. But the door that led to the bedroom was no longer there. In its place was a section of blank wall. I stood in front of it, and I could remember exactly where the door had been. I could remember walking through it the night before. I could remember opening and closing it. But now there was only smooth wall, painted the same color as the rest of the hallway, with no seam or crack to indicate there had ever been an opening. I checked the other doors. The bathroom was still there. The kitchen was still there. But the bedroom was gone, or at least the door to it was gone. The bedroom itself might still exist somewhere, but I could no longer access it. I could no longer access any of my belongings, which were still inside the bedroom. My clothes, my phone, my car keys. The cabin had closed itself off. I tried to leave through the front door. It opened. But the landscape beyond it was not the same. The road that had led to the cabin was no longer there. In its place was forest, dense and dark and extending in every direction. I could see the porch clearly, and the space where my car had been parked, but everything beyond that was trees. The forest had grown closer. It had sealed off the way out. I closed the door and locked it, and I sat in the living room in front of the fire, and I tried to understand what was happening. The photographs had been a message. They had been showing me the progression, the arrival, the initial wrongness, the realization, and then the photograph of the woman alone, with that expression of understanding. That had been the last stage. That was where the progression led. On Wednesday, the cabin began to change more noticeably. The walls seemed to shift slightly when I was not looking directly at them. The dimensions of rooms became unclear. I walked from the kitchen to the living room and somehow arrived at the hallway instead. I tried to navigate by memory, but the cabin, its layout seemed to alter subtly with each movement I made. And the silence had become so intense that it had acquired an almost audible quality. It was like the absence of sound had become a sound itself. A ringing in my ears, a pressure behind my eyes. I found other things in drawers and cabinets as I searched for supplies. A woman's hairbrush, a man's watch, stopped at 3 p.m. A journal filled with scratched out writing, illegible but intense. A bottle of prescription medication, empty. A pair of shoes, different sizes, arranged carefully side by side in the back of a closet. The more I found, the more I understood. The cabin was not just a structure. It was a repository. It held things, people, experiences, and it was showing me all of it because I was becoming part of what it held. On Thursday, I stopped trying to understand the geography of the cabin and simply existed in it. I moved from room to room without expectation. Sometimes I found myself in spaces I did not remember seeing before. A storage room, a cellar with earthen walls. Once, a space that appeared to be underwater, though there was no water, just the sensation of being submerged in something cold and dark that was not quite liquid. I did not sleep. Sleep required a space to lie down, and I no longer trusted the spaces in the cabin enough to close my eyes. On Friday evening, I heard voices. Not words, just the murmur of conversation from somewhere else in the cabin. I followed the sound, moving through rooms that seemed to shift around me. The voices grew clearer. There were multiple people. A man, a woman, others. They sounded calm, almost peaceful, speaking about nothing important, discussing the weather, talking about food, making observations about the fire. I never found them. The voices came from just beyond each door I opened, just around each corner, always moving deeper into the cabin, always leading me farther from where I had been. I gave up looking for them and simply listened. The sound of other people. The sound of voices I could almost understand but never quite hear. It was not comforting, exactly, but it was less lonely than the silence. On Saturday, I realized I could not remember what day I had arrived. Not just the specific date, but the order of days, whether I had been here for 1 day or 1 week or 1 month. Time had become meaningless. There was only the progression of the cabin revealing itself to me, and I was no longer certain whether I was trapped inside it or whether the cabin was inside me. I found the photographs again, scattered throughout the rooms. The same images repeated, the couple smiling, the couple looking worried, the woman alone with that expression of understanding. And then new photographs of me. I did not remember them being taken, but there I was, in various rooms of the cabin, at different moments that I did not recall. In one photograph, I looked terrified. In another, I looked peaceful. In the most recent one, I looked almost transparent, as though I was fading into the background. On Sunday morning, I heard the vehicles, the sound of engines, car doors, voices calling my name. The rescue team had arrived. Someone had reported me missing. They had come to find me. I moved toward the sound, toward where the front door should have been. I opened it, and I could see them clearly. 2 trucks, 5 people. They were looking at the cabin, examining the exterior, and they were confused. I tried to call to them. No sound came out. I tried to wave. They did not look in my direction. One of the rescue workers approached the front door and tried the handle. It was locked. They knocked. I was standing 5 feet away, completely visible in the afternoon light, and they did not see me. I watched as they examined the cabin. They looked through the windows. They went around the back. They discussed what they were finding. The cabin was small, they said. Smaller than expected, but that did not make sense based on the foundation. There should be more space inside. They used tools to force open a window. They entered the cabin, and I followed them inside. The cabin was different with them in it. Smaller, more compact. The hallway was short. The rooms were regular and bounded and logical. They moved through it quickly, calling my name, checking each space. The bedroom door was visible now, a normal door in a normal place. They opened it and found my belongings, my suitcase, my laptop, my phone. But they did not find me. I was standing in the living room while they searched the bedroom, completely visible, breathing the same air they were breathing. But I was not there. I had become something the cabin held, something like the photographs, something like the voices that spoke in rooms I could no longer find. They filed a report, missing person, vehicle on site, belongings in the cabin, no sign of the occupant. Search teams came. They combed the forest. They dragged the streams. They found nothing. The cabin is still there. It is still listed on rental websites. People still book it for weeks of isolation. And I am still here, moving through rooms that shift and change, existing in the spaces between moments, experiencing the progression that each new person goes through when they arrive. I have learned that the cabin does not trap people. It reveals them. It shows them the isolation they came looking for. And once they understand what isolation truly means, once they accept it completely, they become part of its structure. We are the walls now. We are the silence. We are the weight that presses against each new person who arrives looking for solitude. The next person will arrive soon. They always do. And the cabin will begin showing them the photographs, one by one, leading them through the same progression, until they too understand that they are no longer leaving, that no rescue team will ever truly find them, and that the isolation they wanted so desperately has finally arrived, absolute and complete and forever. They will find the cabin empty, but they will never understand what that emptiness contains.